Welcome to the Women on the Wall radio show. We are excited to be in studio today. We haven't been in studio with Josh in a while, and so we are excited to be here in Arlington, Texas. And we've got a great show for you today. There's a lot of things happening. It seems like there's always a lot of things happening when you start getting involved in peeling back the onion in what's happening in our nation, whether it's with education, immigration, national security. They all seem to be tied together.
Right.
And so we're going to talk today about education, and specifically we were just in St. Louis a couple of weeks ago at the EPC conference, Education Policy Conference, and one of the big issues that was discussed was the ESEA reauthorization, which stands for Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which actually passed back in 1965.
Yes.
It's a part, that is what the No Child Left Behind Act is a part of, that passed in 2002. And so right now in Congress, federally, they are looking at reauthorizing that law. And Lamar Alexander, Republican out of Tennessee, is championing this. What we know is this issue of education is very deceptive, because it's not a right versus left, Republican versus Democrat, conservative versus liberal. It's really a matter of the federal government controlling and having control over our children, over their teachers, and over what they are being taught in the classroom. And Josh, you made a good point earlier. Where is it in the Constitution that allows the federal government to have that control?
Well, it's nowhere in the Constitution.
Right.
I want to highlight this point because the ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, back in 1965. Tell me if I'm right or wrong here, Alice. This is the root of federal involvement in our public school education.
Exactly.
This has to be voted on every 5 years, or voted
reauthorized.
Reauthorized. Thank you.
Right.
Every 5 years, and this is where you get the Goals 2000 from the Clinton administration, and this is where you get the No Child Left Behind. It's a DBA. It's a doing business as for the ESEA. It's all ESEA, and then a new president comes in and they put their own label on it.
Exactly.
But it's, when they get the money, there's strings attached to that money.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. And, you know, we've been hearing the battle against Common Core, but what we learned is that Common Core, which are a set of national standards that the copyright is owned by the National Governors Association, that's really the red herring. Because the real issue is with WIOA, which stands for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and the ESEA. That's where they're bringing in these federal mandates. And I just want to we're gonna listen to an audio, and then we're gonna discuss it. But in this audio, it's Tamara Scott, whose show was on yesterday, and she had these mothers that were calling in. And really, it's mothers who are doing the research and uncovering what's really happening here. And so we're going to listen to that. But when they talk about the states having to report to the federal government, I just want to, we listen to this, we're going to talk about that with respect to Texas, because Texas has to report on the via the WIOA Act, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, to the federal government in July of 2016. They are mandated to report. So let's listen to this audio, and I think it'll spark some conversation for us.
Thanks for joining us. I am Tamara Scott. You're listening to Tamara Scott Live with Truth for Our Time. Great show, good information. Michelle Crystal talking to us about Iowa. Meeting tonight, 4:30, Waukee School.
Correct.
4:30 to 6:30. You need to go if you're in the area. More meetings coming up. You can get a hold of those. I've put a link to those meetings on the Truth for Our Time Facebook page. I also have put a link to the Fordham analysis of the New Generation Science Standards, which are only one grade level above what we have currently in Iowa, costing us a whole lot more money for very little gain. And also then joining us, I believe Ann Gassel has stepped away, but Gretchen Logue is still on the phone with Missouri Education Watchdog, and Ann Arthurs is with us from Louisiana, and now joining us is Erin Tuttle in the discussion. Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Now, we've all just kind of been easing into the conversation, and someone just brought up the Lamar Alexander's bill, and you have been studying it and done white papers and explanations on it.
Well, I've done a lot of research on it, as I know many people have, including Gretchen. And I think it's interesting because when I was listening to your show earlier and you're talking about the National Science Standards,
yep,
it might be shocking to hear, or maybe it isn't shocking to this crew, but Indiana, who had A science standards, a grade of A, is also now contemplating adopting the next generation science standards.
For a whopping C? You would
you
would trade a grade A to a whopping C. Why would they do that?
Exactly, and it's interesting because I was looking to our State Board of Ed agenda, and they had a memo on the adoption of the Next Generation Science Standards, and the format they want to follow sounds very similar to the one that she was talking about earlier, to have this task force and all of this. So I think it is not a coincidence that these states are all following sort of the same model. And it begs the question, where is it coming from? And I think most of us would agree it's coming from a lot of places, but mostly from Washington, D.C. So that's why I think it's important to pay attention to the reauthorization bill, because so much of what we do is not state-led. It's kind of force-fed from the federal government.
And you're talking about the No Child Left Behind reauthorization bill.
That's right. And I'm not an attorney, and I don't claim to be an expert, but a lot of us, and Gretchen included, who have followed the waivers and followed the race to the top and followed those applications and have read them carefully, you start to familiarize yourself with certain language. Language that you see in the waivers, in race to the top, means certain things. It caused certain things to be implemented in certain ways. And so when you see some of the same language in Senator Lamar Alexander's bill, it strikes you. What might seem fairly like reasonable language or kind of innocuous in its effect. When you know what those things do, you realize that it will have a very serious implication for states and their ability to govern education policy at the state level.
And he did add in this bill the subjects that are going to be required to have standards that meet his approval, or meet Arnie Duncan's approval for the Title I funds. It does include science. It was, it's not just math, reading, and language arts, but they did add science. So it's interesting, Erin. How you doing?
I'm good.
Yeah, that might be another reason, too, now that you're saying that. It triggered something about your state changing, to once again move towards these common science standards.
Now, I thought Lamar Alexander had a bill forward that was going to squelch the terminology I saw, I think it was from Politico, would squelch the number of federal standardized tests. Is that a different bill? Is that just fancy language on this bill?
Well, they say all these great things. The purpose written into the law, whereas the purpose, its stated purpose, is to restore freedom to parents and teachers, principals, and other school leaders, states, governors, and local communities so that they can improve their local public schools. You'll see all kinds of language in it that it's going to do all of these great things, but then all of these great, proclamations are all negated by other language. Like, for example, every state has to supply the Secretary of Education with their state plan, and your state plan is supposed to provide assurances that you have state standards, that you have assessments aligned to the standards, and that you have an accountability system in place for schools who are not, meeting those standards as evidenced by the assessment. So in that, they say, so when you are going to present the Secretary of Education with your state plan, it requires in Senator Lamar Alexander's bill that the standards be aligned to that standards that will, and I'm quoting here, specify what children are expected to know. Oh, I'm sorry, that's what it used to be. So No Child Left Behind used to say that the standards had to specify what children are expected to know and do, be able to do, contain coherent and rigorous content, and encourage the teaching of advanced skills. So that's pretty broad. A state could develop their set of standards using those parameters and still come up with their own fairly unique set of standards.
Right.
So that language is gone, and now it says that the standards must have alignment, and that alignment has to be with, and I quote, the entrance requirements without the need for academic remediation for an institution of higher education in the state. Now, that language is very familiar, right? That's the same language that they used in the waiver, that we had to have standards that were college and career ready. Mm-hmm. Well, college and career ready, that's the definition that they use. It aligns with the entrance requirements for post-secondary institutions without remediation. That's the same language they have in Race to the Top. Now, in both of those applications, your state institutions of higher ed, your post-secondary state public universities made assurances that they would align their entrance requirements to the expectations of Common Core. So you see, by putting this in here, a state plan cannot be submitted unless the standards are aligning with the Common Core expectations. Mm-hmm. Because that's what the entrance requirements are going to be at your state universities. They already are. They've already gone through. I mean, most of them, this has already been completed. So they made these assurances years ago in these applications, and they've been working very steadily towards that aim. So does that make, I know it's kind of a little technical, but,
Alice, going through some of this stuff and talking with y'all, kind of the history of this, back with the Goals 2000, mm-hmm. was that with that, the states had to set standards.
Right.
But they could be whatever they set them as.
Right.
And there was no penalties if the students didn't meet those standards.
Right.
And in exchange for doing that, the states would get federal money.
Correct.
Then with No Child Left Behind, what that was is the states got to set their standards, but if they didn't meet those standards, there was a punishment associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And one of the standards was that No Child Left Behind, 100% of the kids in the 2013-2014 school year would have to meet those standards. And it was AYP, it was a graduated,
right.
From year to year, a higher percentage of the kids had to meet those standards.
Right.
And it didn't work. Everybody agrees it was a dismal failure. So what the Common Core standards were is they said, well, we'll set the standards.
Right.
And now we're hearing that the colleges are aligning their entrance exams to those standards.
And these standards are based on an education of equity. So they're wanting to close the gap. So in order to close the gap, as Dr. Peg Luxick explains, they take the standard down to the very lowest common denominator. Mm-hmm. So those standards for college entrance are so low that anybody can get over them. Mm-hmm. But what value is a college education now? What they're basically is they're bringing the standard, it's an education of equity, lowering the standards so low that our colleges basically become hubs for vocational education. We're no longer teaching our children how to read well, write well, and do math. so that they have the freedom to be and do whatever we want, whatever they want. What you've got are these public-private partnerships of big corporations that are deciding what jobs they need. And then they will fill those positions based on the people that are coming through, not just, college, but through K through 12. We're basically sorting our children beginning in preschool, really, because they're collecting data and the assessments. What's interesting in the ESEA reauthorization is on page 20. It mandates assessing children and reporting to the federal government diagnostic testing on our children. And that testing is interpretive diagnostic testing. And they're not testing, do they know 2 + 2 is 4, knowledge-based. They're testing competency. They're testing where they are based on attitudes, values, beliefs, and behavior.
So they're testing attitudes, values, beliefs, and behavior.
Exactly.
This is why you hear stories like the one where the math problem was given to a group of 3 kids. And the one kid who said 3 times 4 is 12 got the answer wrong because he didn't agree with the other 2 kids. This is. Yeah. I mean, y'all know this is what's happening.
It's cultural Marxism. It's cultural Marxism.
Oh, there you go, using that Marxism.
Yeah. I know. But those academic people, they know what cultural Marxism is. And what's happening is in our education, the education of our children is not knowledge-based, where you have a teacher that knows how to do math well and teaches children to do math. There is a political purpose behind the way that we're teaching math. There is a political purpose behind the fact that in 1908, they moved from phonics and decoding of words to whole language. Robin Eubanks talks about in her book, Credential to Destroy, that the political purpose behind doing that is that children, if they actually can decode words and find the true meaning of words, their world is opened to not being propagandized,
right.
Indoctrinated, because they know the meaning of words. When you teach sight language and whole language, the political purpose of that is that whoever is teaching you that language decides what the meaning of the word is.
Manipulated.
Don't you agree?
Well, I mean, what you're saying is the outcome can help us understand what the motivation is. If you have a better form of teaching, and you substitute it for a lesser form of teaching because it gives you a certain outcome, then it tells us what those people's motivation for switching that is.
Exactly. And that's the political purpose is cultural Marxism. It's making our children, the next generation of Americans, subservient. You're subduing their knowledge.
And in case people think that this is some radical idea, I'll remind them that on the campaign trail, President Barack Obama said he just wants to spread the wealth around.
Yeah.
Yes.
Obviously. Yeah.
Well, and really that's what a big part of this is controlling the economy of the West. And whether it's from the big corporations who want to control the workforce, or if it's on a global level, which this is being led globally, it's to control the economy of the West. I tell people, does my kid get a good job and succeed in life if he knows that 2 + 2 is 4 and can read well and write well? Or does he get a good job because he believes in gay marriage or marriages between a man and a wife? If we're not teaching our children how to read well and do math, in the world economy, they're closing the gap. We're equal with everybody. And that's really what this is. Don't you agree?
I keep thinking in the back of my mind, what I see here is that all of these people that we have let into our country who they do not have a good education to begin with, but we've flooded our schools with these type of children. And when you're talking about an education of equity, it's impossible for them to bring all of those kids up to where our children used to be. So they're obviously bringing ours down to the lower level.
Well, you make a great point there. That's one of the things that I found with the No Child Left Behind. During those interim years before we got to the 100% standard in 2013-14, what would happen is because they only needed a certain percentage of kids to meet that goal, that assessment, I think is the word I'm looking for here, Alice.
Right.
So let's say it's at 70%. I don't know, I'm pulling a number off the top of my head, but let's say it's 70%. Well, the kids at the bottom end of the run, they're not getting an education because we don't need you to meet that goal, that 70% goal.
Right.
And the kids at the top of the spectrum that can walk into the classroom the first day and pass the assessment, they're not getting an education because you're already passing the goal. And so it's that one size fits all standard that you're talking about. The sinister thing that I see with the Common Core education is that it's not the state standard of 70%, 80% or whatever, but it's now on the individual through Bill Gates' computers. Am I right or wrong here?
Right.
That it's down to the individual level of you will get the message that you will get past the assessment that we're giving to you. And the assessment is what? Submit to authority and go along with the group.
Well, and what's scary about that, it's just like the individual mandate on health care. It's an individual mandate on a child. That, and when you look at the people who are behind this, when you look at Hillary Clinton and Mark Tucker, back when they were developing Hillary Care, Mark Tucker was working with her to develop basically the federal takeover of our education system. And he said the federal government should remold the entire American system for human resource development, a seamless system of unending skill development that begins in the home with the very young and continues through school, post-secondary education, and the workplace. I don't know about you guys. I don't look at my children and think of them as a human resource for the federal government. But yet that's what we're doing. We're handing our children to the federal government.
The philosophy goes from you can be whatever you want to be to you can be whatever the assessments tell us that you can be.
Right.
Well, and when you look at math specifically, and what's fascinating about Robin Eubank's book is she goes back and she reads the books that these people write. She listens to the audio. She reads what these people with the political intent, political purpose have. And so this is a quote. "We first need to determine the moral, social, and political order we believe to be desirable. Then set out our educational purposes in light of those purposes, choose curriculum and content objectives." That's from the What Constructivism Might Be in Mathematics Education conference. That was Jeremy Kilpatrick from 1987 had that quote. Jeremy Kilpatrick is very much involved in developing the Common Core. They have a political intent.
So the change that Bill Ayers wanted to effect by blowing up the World Trade Center,
Yes.
that he didn't get accomplished there, he went into education to get it accomplished through our education system.
Yes. And they've done an excellent job. I mean, we've all assumed that education was pretty much like it was years ago, you know, because we believe that most of the people here, you know, love this country. You know, we had a few differences, but now we've learned that's not the case at all. There are people that want to totally destroy it and change it into something we don't recognize anymore.
What you said, Alice, they want to equalize the world. They want to bring down the West.
Bring us down.
Not go over to the East or to Africa and bring them up.
Right.
I mean, that would be common sense. The
Yeah.
answer is to bring,
Well-
and it's our children. This is the thing I think is so sinister and, dare I say, evil.
Yeah.
Well, and it truly is it's a revolution. The definition of a revolution is changing the form of government. And they're changing us from a constitutional republic to a democracy. Our founding fathers warned us of a democracy. And what you see in, for instance, the issue of school choice and federalizing school choice to where they changed the definition of what Title I money comes from the federal government, and it was supposed to be for children of poverty, economically disadvantaged children that needed lunch money, basically. They've changed the definition to academically disadvantaged. So they changed the definitions of words. And so now with school choice, they want for that Title I money to follow the child. When that Title I money follows the child, that school that takes that money is now under these federal mandates and assessments. So basically, you have federalized our private schools. And what's so scary about that is if all private schools were like Hillsdale and would not take that federal money, we would be okay. But what we see is that's not what's happening. And when you have Republicans who are pushing school choice, school choice, school choice, we've talked about it before.
Right.
Choice is no choice. If all of the schools come under the same assessments,
And
the
we
same
see it.
mandates,
Even
we see
Bob Jones Publishing
Yes.
Yes.
is conformed to the Common Core standards.
Right. It's a very it's a stealth cultural Marxism. They're coming in from the ground up.
And there's no elected school board
And there's
anymore.
no-
you have
that
no
was my
control.
point.
You have no control.
If their goal is to collapse the public school system, federalize our private schools, and then all we have are charter schools, which are public schools. They get that money, that federal money, but they're run by appointed boards, and that appointed board is beholden to whoever's giving the money.
Right.
We have lost all control, and that's what on the Wednesday night communication team conference call, a perfect example of this is in New Orleans, in Louisiana, because after Katrina, you had all this Title I money going in to New Orleans, and you don't have a public school system in Louisiana like you do in other states. It's all charter schools. But you also have parents have no voice because you have no elected official. That is very scary. And parents, we talked about it last night, parents have just kind of decided that's our fate. We have no other options. And here we have Bobby Jindal, who sounds great against Common Core. He's against the Common Core national standards, but he's all for school choice and implementing what's disastrous in Louisiana, which if you listen to the marketing of charter schools, it sounds great until you actually talk to parents. And the parents are going, this is disastrous. It's disastrous. So we're in a very scary time. And if we don't stand up, we're lost. Our children are lost. We will have allowed an educational revolution to change the very fundamental concepts of our constitutional republic.
That's what he said he would do.
Exactly.
Are we surprised? And for those parents who think that taking their children out of school, out of the school system and homeschooling, this is one of the things that Peg Lexick points out, which is absolutely terrifying to me, is that at some point, maybe 5, 10, 20 years down the road, we're not sure, But whenever they're changing the assessment test to get into college to conform to Common Core standards, and so you don't do stack addition anymore.
Right.
25 plus 34 plus 15, and you come up with the answer. That you do this bizarro form of addition.
Sense.
And it doesn't matter, they'll tell you, it doesn't matter if you get the right answer or not, because the right answer is, did you do it the way that we told you to?
Yeah, did you conform?
Right.
Did you follow our directions?
Exactly. Did you
Yeah,
conform? Did you submit to
right.
the authority and
Right.
go along with
Yes,
the group?
exactly. Even though you know it's not right.
And so, let me make this one point, Alice. At some point, for those parents who bring their kids out of that system and are teaching them common sense, in an educational, common sense educational approach to do the stack addition, so forth and so on, at what point that they can't pass those assessment tests, and so now the government has to step in and say they have a moral obligation because your kids can't pass the test.
Right.
We're going to have to outlaw homeschool. We're going to have to
I'm sure
outlaw
I'd love to.
this private school, this
Yes.
Hellsdale that won't take the federal
Marching
money.
orders, right.
Yeah. I mean,
Sure.
that is the direction that we are going.
That's
And-
probably the worst case. The best case scenario is that those kids grow up in a generation of idiots.
Right.
All their peers are idiots.
Right. Well, and it goes back to what Luca, who we had here in studio, he said what happened in Italy. And as he was growing up, his parents were in a position to be able to protect he and his brother and educate them, give them a good education, knowledge-based education. But he said, what happened to all the other kids in my elementary class? And what happened to my country? He's no longer an Italian citizen. He's a European. You're no
Right.
longer
A citizen of the world.
Exactly. Aside from just equalizing America and the world economically, and you can go on any school district in the state of Texas even and look at their vision and their mission statement, and it's all about
Global.
educating a global child. You're no longer that kid from Arlington, Texas, who was a Catholic or a Protestant or a Boy Scout or a football player or a band director or a drum major. You are now a global citizen. You've lost all national identity. They're doing to us what they did in Italy, and nobody sees it.
The model.
It's multiculturalism.
Right.
That's why Barack Obama goes on the television and he condemns Christianity 1,000 years ago,
Yeah.
equating it to burning a man alive and broadcasting it around the world.
Right.
Insanity.
You know, it's interesting because in 1976 there was a book written based on a letter by a guy named Turchenko, and the book was, or the letter was immediately translated into English, and a book was written, "The Scientific and Technological Revolution of the Education and the Education Revolution." And Turchenko explains, submission will be largely invisible. It is the unconscious human response being cultivated. And Robin talks about, remember, the Soviets had lots of sympathizers in the West. They were professors. These professors were in a position to urge practices that in fact amounted to unilateral mental disarmament. Unilateral mental disarmament. And that's what I go back to what Mel Moss said when we first started doing the radio show. Basically, we're allowing them, we're funding our own demise, and we're allowing them to use our children to do it. That's really what we're doing here. And when you look at the situation with immigration, and you look at, this morning I was listening to the congressional hearings on the education and workforce development, and they were talking about how important it was to have comprehensive immigration reform so that we can bring in all of these workers.
Well, let me tell you about all these workers they bring in. I noticed that our friend Ray Myers has from time to time been posting photographs of large buses carrying illegals in them. And I have as well seen many when I've been coming up this way, stopped at various, filling stations and stuff. And none of these people look as if, a lot of them, they're very old, first of all. They're not going to be joining our workforce. They're going to be on Social Security, which is what they do.
Right.
And they're just dropping them everywhere.
Right.
And the communities are having to absorb them, and the younger ones, obviously, in the school system.
You're right.
Just dumping them.
Well, and it's so interesting because when you look at this template, if you will, of cultural Marxism infiltrating in, whether it's the infiltration from, Central America, and it's not in our friend, was it Alan Wall that talked about the, it wasn't Alan.
It was Rick Altman.
Rick Altman talks about it's not even the illegals that are coming
naturalization.
in. It's naturalization that is the problem. Think about this. Think about the naturalization or the stealth jihad of the Muslim infiltration. Do you know in New York, I had a friend of mine send me videos and pictures from in New York where they will do the Muslim prayers and they will block the city will come to a halt on streets because they're doing their Muslim prayer in the streets. That is a stealth jihad using the tactic and strategy of cultural Marxism to infiltrate. And their enforcement is Sharia law. And we can't even get ALAC passed in Texas, American Laws for American
That's
Courts.
just insanity. And yeah.
So when you look at, and I bring it back to, if you look at whether it's the, the Bill Ayers using this tactic and strategy to do socialist revolution through education, or it's the Muslim Brotherhood doing it, or if it's the guys on the right who are doing it because they believe that they have the answer, and that if they were just in control and had power of the federal government, that they could, it's the Bill Bennetts, it's the Mike Huckabees. You know what makes America exceptional is the individual. Not the individual mandate from the federal government, but the individual. That's what gives us innovation. That's what gives us, like my uncle who invented the first shrimp peeling machine that revolutionized the seafood packing industry. Think of how many jobs he provided for people because he gave them dignity and a job.
Plus, he shut down the cost of shrimp.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
They
Because
don't
you didn't
want
have to pay
innovation.
They
though.
don't want innovation.
The large corporations and the powers that be, they don't want that. They don't want us to be.
So we're in a interesting time, but have hope. Have hope, because the three of us are sitting here in this studio. None of us are being paid for it.
Right.
We're trying to figure out if there's anyone that wants to sponsor this radio show, please call us. We're looking for sponsors because we have to keep speaking truth to power. We have to not allow these think tanks and foundations and organizations to control our message. And that's what we see happening in politics today, even on the right, is that you have organizations that are funding the re-election of our elected officials. And what's going to save us is us showing up and speaking truth to power, whether it's through this radio show, whether it's through, showing up at your local school board meeting to find out what's going on, or running yourself. running for local school board, running for elected office. But once you get in, you can't forget where you came from.
Right.
And that's the key. We need more people like that.
Hey, Alice, I keep looking at this comment that Virginia Fox made.
Oh,
I want you to just kind of close out with that comment, because I thought it was great when she was talking about.
This morning I was listening to the hearings, and Governor Pence was talking about, how great their workforce development was, and the training that they were doing at the lower and lower levels, in the high school, and Congressman Fox kind of reprimanded him, and she said, because he said, we're training for the workforce, and she said, we train dogs, we educate people.
Right.
And that's really what this is about. We need to educate our children so that they have the skills, not only to get a good job, but that they know things. I want to close with this quote from Robin's book. She says, "A phonetically fluent reader has unrestrained access to information. A sight reader does not. Language is the tool of logical and analytical thought. Sight reading keeps that toolbox both relatively empty and filled only with the word tools someone has deliberately placed there." And when we teach our children to think analytically, once they are educated to do that, the other side who wants to propagandize them can't do that, because they can think for themselves, and they're an individual who can speak up. And in our First Amendment rights as Americans, we need to hold on to, or we won't be in a studio like this, speaking truth to power. So with that, we'll close out the show, and we will continue to fight the good fight.
Yeah.
Going
Thanks, Josh.
forward. Thank you,
We
Josh.
appreciate it.
Great show.